The Forgotten City is a campaign for Skyrim that is set up in an unorthodox manner a la storyteller mode. And in it the player plays through a mixing of conventional linear questing and story-driven investigation similar to what you might see in story-driven RPGs. A comparison would be the common 2D RPG that's more focused on storyline than gameplay, and there are a lot of those that go off the template given by something like RPG Maker or something like that. Maybe think of it as, in some sense, although it's a low-resolution description, of something like a Pokemon-style 2D game, except that you're more interested in exploring and investigating the city rather than going about and catching Pokemon or whatever. Except it's 3 dimensions, and there's obviously a fantasy RPG twist to it, etc., etc. And of course, I don't want to reduce the description of the mod to that, but it has that feel to it as you're going about trying to figure things out in the city.
Are you ready?
Firstly, I'd like to point out that the unorthodox presentation may be offsetting to some Skyrim players because you don't typically get letters talking to you or voices all about as you go through corridors and such. In some occasions it certainly contributed to the uniqueness of the campaign, but in others it seemed sort of unnecessary, particularly with respect to the letters themselves. By the way, this is sort of a skeleton walkthrough that mostly demonstrates how to pass the main quest and doesn't cover much of the side quests, of which there are plenty. The campaign begins when you enter the entrance to the Forgotten City that is buried behind the waterfall near Markarth. By the way, if you follow exactly what I'm saying and doing here, you will get through the rest of the quest, so even if it seems weird, like killing the guy that you'll see in a moment and restarting the quest, etc., it's basically, as far as I know, the fastest way to pass the campaign. I wanted to comment also on a few things that stood out in this mod in particular that players and designers alike should take note of. Firstly, the character development here takes a stark contrast to other mods in which designers don't give any attention to characters or do the bare minimum. Both Wormstooth and Falskar, for example, fall prey to this weakness. Wormstooth in particular is an example of what you shouldn't really do with characters at all. There are 4 followers in Wormstooth that are basically useless, both in terms of the plot and in terms of most gameplay interactions. There was absolutely no point in using them. Falskar demonstrably makes a better effort in making convincing characters, but the characters for the most part come off as simplistic and undeveloped except in certain occasions. In Forgotten City, the characters are both believable and important. They all contribute something to the storyline and have distinct and developed personalities and backgrounds. This is some of the best voice acting in Skyrim I know of, albeit the quality is not impressive per se, but it does the job and it does the job well. So this is another thing I haven't covered yet. Firstly, do not make a character if they do nothing to contribute to the storyline. Now, if you want to make an NPC that says 1 or 2 lines and then sort of disappears, that's fine. That's not what I mean by a character. I mean someone that you highlight as important, whether it's implied or obviously displayed. If afterwards the character does absolutely nothing, it's kind of senseless and is evidence of poor storyline development. character development is something that is adjacent to storyline development, and should be taken more seriously than the average Skyrim designer takes it. Why? Because players having been through the vanilla Skyrim experience, let's say, and having gone through tons of interactions with characters that are at least developed enough to serve a role in the game, they see through the nonsensical plot decisions made from mediocre ideas that come from the minds of some of these designers. So for instance, in Wormstooth, you first, before going to the island, have to find 4 different characters. So you have to do a lot of traveling and make an effort to find these people, and they say a few kind of corny, humorous lines. And after that, for the remainder of the entirety of the campaign, only do 2 things. Follow you, well, make Starky comments every so often, follow you, and wipe off some enemies, again, every so often. And that's sort of the ideal case of a useless character, and there's 4 of them. So that was not a good idea. Of course, in this case, this is kind of the opposite, or coming from the opposite end. Every character has a background. Every character is somehow contributing to this social network that the player explores through as they're going through the city. Now, this also goes along with voice acting. Here the voice acting is more than good enough to get by in most cases because personality is added to each voice. So not only is the voice actor saying things on the mic, they're not saying things generically, they're adding personality to it. They're trying to act out the character that they're assigned to, which is what you're supposed to do in voice acting. Voice acting shouldn't really be any different from acting in the sense that you're acting, or perhaps more appropriately, becoming a character in this world, not just saying things generically on a script. So there is kind of a pet peeve I think every player has at this point, which is poor quality voice acting. Now in some cases here it's a bit wonky and you can hear the garbage sound quality and fuzzy mic input. Rarely, but it's still there. The point being, if you don't have quality mic, do not voice act, and if you're the person who decides what goes and what does not go, do not accept voice acting if the sound quality is not excellent. There's no excuse for this at all. So let's get into the analysis, and we shall treat the whole of the level design as one level set. So in terms of architecture, we don't really see much out of this campaign, and actually before we go forward, we can talk about why this is important. It appears that the designer of this campaign focused more on storyline than anything else. Magnifying one aspect of a game over all others does not compensate for the lack of quality or work given to other aspects of the game. I think I elaborated on this a very long time ago, and I explained why that was a bad idea. Basically, it looks like what happens is, if that one aspect is profound enough, players will remember it, and they will remember at the same time the lacking aspects of it as well. So in the end you get a mixed bag wherein, for instance, the storyline gets a nod at the same time that the player or players are disappointed by the rest of the game. So as a whole, it isn't an experience that you'd remember as wholesomely excellent. Now you might say the storyline is more important than other aspects, which is fine, but that is still not an excuse to disregard other aspects of the game, as we will see here. And you have those aspects in front of you as well. If the whole point of this creation is solely the storyline to the point where other aspects are irrelevant, why make it at all? In other words, if the visuals, gameplay, atmosphere, including auditory immersion, are effectively unimportant, what's the point of making the mod? Why not just write a story? Because in a story, you're provided with that single isolated aspect, and there you can only pay attention to the story. By making a creation of this composition, you're conceding that you believe that the other aspects are important because you are contributing to them. And this means that you either do a poor job or a sufficient job or more. So paying little to no attention to other aspects necessarily exacts a reduction in overall quality of the creation. So here we have a perfect example. I mean, to summarize, the architecture here is a bit wonky. The structure is overly simplistic and never gets more intrinsic than what you see in the exterior of the underground city. Most of the constructs are only composed of base meshes onto which one should further elaborate with architectural motifs, details, and appendages. Most of the center of the city is composed only of single meshes, which is fine if there were something more interesting onto which such things could be placed on in the remainder of the canvas, but there isn't. And here is one particular case in which we can realize the importance of facades and their utility. The facades in these levels are generally mediocre. There is so great an opportunity for an improvement in architectural detail here that the inattention to that opportunity is artistically troubling. Remember, we should pay attention to the structure of the architecture because of the prefabrication argument, which I basically explained before. In a nutshell, the meshes are not made by the level designer in Skyrim for almost every single case, but the composition of them in the level is. Therefore, we can judge the quality of the work of the level designer by that composition, but we cannot do it by the sheer detail and architecture within one mesh, because that is not their work. The impact of facades in architecture may be more deeply impacting than one might expect. Some of you that have studied or read into psychology a bit might know of the deterministic phenomenon in which humans interpret human faces, which inevitably loosely extrapolates to face-like figures. The latter is called pareidolia, where humans see face figures. Developing scientific work seems to indicate that, to some degree, moods can be conveyed through the structure of building facades, and in relation to the same phenomena, there is perhaps a sense of aestheticism and beauty due to the same mechanism through which humans rate certain faces as more beautiful than others. I'll link you to some of these scientific articles in the description if you're interested. Every facade in this level set is only composed of a base underneath sometimes asymmetric and always simplistic geometric features. It's the equivalent of a cathedral without the flying buttresses, without the varying windows, without towers, without arcs, without motifs, except for a pair of simple windows on each end. There is innovation here, but novel experimentations with constructs, in this case, only seem to result in mediocre creations. There is certainly a strong sense of atmosphere in various portions of the campaign, especially in the beginning as well as in the underground tunnels and in the underground core. But since the player is mostly walking around in the exterior of the city, the profound case is the area in which the atmosphere is conveyed the least and in an unconvincing manner. The more problematic case is the visual immersion. The plain and universal lighting in the exterior erases potential for more interesting touches on shading and colorization, and the layout doesn't help, as it is also quite plain. There are visually interesting cases in this campaign wherein lighting is experimented with, but the lighting overall is clumsily painted onto the levels. Auditory immersion fares far better, but there also isn't much of it. The music itself didn't do much for me in terms of conveying certain moods, or whether it conveyed much of a mood at all that sort of paralleled with the visuals. There is a sufficient amount of detail in every level which drives away visual boredom, and it's basically detail that salvages this mod visually, although there are some cases where poor technical execution causes gaffes, such as the massively scaled static meshes whose textures are blurred out and giant that are not covered up by additional details. Such artifacts give off a sense of unprofessionalism. Most of the game interactions involve investigating and exploring, and the campaign does an excellent job of setting up the constraints for the way it is meant to be played. Unfortunately, for more impatient players, digging through the plot in order to progress through the quest can become a long-winded effort because of the slow gameplay style this campaign operates in. Those who are more appreciative of stories, character relationships, novels, and plots will enjoy exploring the town and figuring things out as they discover new details and background of each character. At the same time, however, it should be noted that what little combat gameplay there is falls short of decent, largely due to poor sequencing techniques and poor combat choreography, as it were. For instance, the invading bandits, which come in basically almost right after you enter into the city in the past, come off as a clumsy effort when seen from inside, as they appeared out of thin air into the water. Another case was the mindless wraiths who chased you from inside the Dwemer building, the temple, and who could easily be thwarted with simple techniques that demonstrate the dumbness of the AI. And I realize that the AI itself is not the creation of the author, but for instance, one simple solution to the problem here would be to vary the arsenal of monsters and the weapons they use in each combat scenario, not only in the sense that you're varying the monster itself from mesh to mesh, from totally different monsters, but in terms of combat AI templates, which can be easily switched out, and a designer has full access to that. There were quite a few areas in which conceptual grandness bloomed, but it mostly didn't. The interiors were highly lacking and didn't give you a sense of place. The potential for visual awe was overpowered by the bad visuals brought on by poorly designed lighting and plainness previously talked about. The experimentation with lighting certainly did contribute to visual creativity, but there was also quite a bit of bad lighting, such as the over-magnified intensity of the interior lights, which did nothing but add nasty glares that needlessly obfuscated base meshes. The cases in which scenes were visually awing, such as in the interior garden in the Dwemer Temple and the underground core, are largely forgotten in light of the clumsily devised scene of the exterior of the city. Storyline, on the other hand, as I said before, stands out as iconic, and it's an iconic example of depth of plot. The storyline is well developed, as are the characters, and it's easy to tell that, And it's also easy to tell that the designer took the time to lay out an organized way in which the plot should unfold, what the player was to do or may do, how the thematic message should be conveyed. Unlike the overwhelming majority of Skyrim campaigns and quests, that is, those, of course, that are third-party, that are modern campaigns, not vanilla Skyrim, not the DLCs. But those in particular lack something, and there is actually some depth and thematic relevance to the storyline here, unlike the overwhelming majority of mods. And it brings up the idea of pure order, and through the interactions with characters as well as the antagonist, or perhaps antagonists, we can see the theme as being actively conveyed. One of the main ideas being the nature of man and his instinct to act upon desire as a mechanism prior to the imposition of a superego apparatus, whether that be conveyed or represented as the law, or civic morality, or civilization, or whatever. It reminds me of what the Underground Man said in Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. Quote, "He would even risk his cakes, and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men still are men and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar." There are also various subplots and points of interest that bring up various other ideas as well. And in addition to this, there are different endings that the player can finish on when completing the campaign. In summary, this is basically an ideal example of a tunnel vision style emphasis on a single aspect of the game, in which the remainder of the design of the game, or the mod in this case, suffers because of the focus on one single aspect. Since most of this serves as basically a spoiler, I also want to point out a few hints as to where to go to progress some of the side quests. So there's one house, the House of the Dark Elf, that usually is on the dock. His house has the accessible entrance to the underground tunnels, where you'll find some of the items to complete some of these side quests that the characters give you, as well as begin one or two other quests. And also, there are a few points of interest. If you go to the bar, for example, you can talk to the bartender, who will basically, for all practical purposes, give you hints, although they're masked as rumors as to where to go, or certain indications as to where to be for certain side quests. So that's another thing as well. So, in this case, it seemed like the general sense from the public, from players, was not as vehement in favor of a blindfolded approach to the judgment of the quality of this mod. So it's a more measured response to the experience. But at the same time, I still am seeing some of these things from people. Usually, it's reviewers, quote-unquote reviewers, who basically make a pseudo-review of the mod, or kind of summarize it, and then conclude after that summary that it's excellent, while never going through the reasoning that they should need to go to in order to establish that. And there, again, for this mod in particular, of course it merits critical praise in some areas, but this sense that I'm getting from the Skyrim community, which is to blindly praise a mod, or at least magnify those opinions and those criticisms which favor the mod and kind of obfuscate others, is kind of problematic. And it also seems that there are no people who disagree with the level of critical acclamation that this mod got. Now, certainly, again, in terms of storyline, it is a mod that deserves critical praise. But at the same time, I'm not seeing a more reasoned, more careful, and more analytical, and even more articulate approach to deciding the quality of a mod. And maybe I'm from, like I don't want to say an elitist community, but like basically the Unreal, back in the day, the Unreal community, single player campaign was very, very careful and very critical. So coming out of that and seeing basically players kind of wholly embracing something that also has evident flaws as far as I'm concerned, is maybe simply an artifact of my background, because I come from the Unreal community, not the Skyrim community. But if even that's the reason why, I think it's appropriate to take more measured approaches to rating these mods. And so what I would like to see actually is more players stepping away from this kind of blind approach to review, and making a more elaborate review and asking questions relating to whether you truly enjoyed every aspect of the mod, if you have and whether you have biases towards certain aspects which preclude you from noticing that other aspects are flawed, etc., etc. Basically, something more analytical, which seems to be deeply lacking in the Skyrim community, and not so well. It wasn't lacking in the real community when it was thriving.
Strangest of all,